So, I'd like to start and remind you to take all of this information with a grain of salt. I'm not here to convince you or sway your beliefs beyond anything that you want to allow, but I do ask that you keep an open mind. What I'm referencing has been looked at from a multitude of angles, and while there is a somewhat sturdy consensus, there is much to be explored. We can only really begin to comprehend a small fraction of what the universe presents before us in this lifetime. So I'm attempting to explain a rather indescribable phenomenon, so stick with me. If you have any questions by the end of this, feel free to reach out to me. I can't guarantee answers, but I will do my best to address what you bring to the table. I've studied the nature of the spirit for almost a decade, and several years prior even in bits and pieces. So I've tried to include as much research and science as I can, as I feel this helps bring forth more validation. But this body of information is a work in progress and will continue to be far, far past my days in this life. But I genuinely hope that it benefits you in your journey and gives you a difference of perspective. So I will try to be brief, but I also want to be thorough in the way that I present this. So take it at your own pace and break it up if need be. So I'm going to concentrate on living beings' personal fields for now, and specifically in reference to humans, but remember that there are fields surrounding all living matter on all scales and walks of life. So with the electromagnetic field, our physical body is surrounded and enveloped by these matrices of subtle energies that are supporting, they're shaping, and animating the physical body. They display intelligence that transcends human knowing. And chi is probably what I hear to be most commonly used as a word or phrase, but there are an assortment of names for this flow here, and you'll find that spiritual nature is described in numerous fashions, and language is going to vary with culture and geographical location, but this doesn't take away from the idea behind it. So really try to look beyond the practices and the dogmas tied to world thinking, and remember the principles of what they stand for and why. So really knowing what clicks within yourself and how you individually connect to the universal domain, find those common threads. But this flow is very consistently engaged in a dialogue that can either foster or debilitate health. One's general temperament is going to be the climate of his or her field. There are more stable portions of one's field, and there are those that shift. One's electromagnetic field moves and transforms with daily interactions and moods. So as we encounter stimuli, we biologically and psychologically respond. Scientists actually use a tool called the SQUID. It's a superconducting quantum interference device to measure fields. But our fields can also be perceived and sensed in many other ways. So our field changes prior to there being an actualization of physical reality. So within our field is contained a prototype of sorts, and this is patterned after full biological development. So an embryo carries an informational field that guides it into its adult form and governs its instinctive behavior. So it coerces growth in that way. And it's motivated by acts of conscious observance and loops itself in modes of reflective feedback. So our field is connected to broader universal coding, memory, and awareness. Usually, our fields extend about 4 to 5 feet out from the body, but this fluctuates. If someone is more on guard or amidst less welcome stimuli, for instance, their field may close in as a means of protection. But when of a bright or opened disposition, that field may broaden much further beyond just several feet. And I would like to add that you can consciously manipulate it as well. And as a side note, dowsing is also a technique typically used to find groundwater or metals and gemstones below the earth, but can additionally be used to find the edges of one's field. So this is done with two L-shaped metal rods. So physical reality is influenced by subjective conscious observance. Matter follows energy, and conversely, energy follows matter. So we're looking at a reciprocal nature present here. For example, if someone were to cut themselves with a sharp object, that tear will thereafter also be present and noticeable in his or her field. And on the flip side, let's say someone reacts emotionally to a situation and that feeling persists over time. That shift will occur in the field before physical symptoms occur in the body. So mind, body, and spirit are never separate from one another. They act as a unit. We are essentially channels or offshoots, streams of consciousness embodying physical form carried from higher levels and magnitudes of consciousness, so those more advanced forms. We are an extension of the Creator in that way, and there is consistent correspondence of self and higher consciousness. So in this lifetime, we are bridging our spiritual form with more physically minded layers. We're dealing with the ego, the brain, and time-space dimensionality, so as to have a greater capacity for growth and learning via polarity, so via stimuli and experience. And when I talk of the ego, it's usually in regards to our lens of distortion. So we have planes of pure existence and states of all-knowing versus these veils of creative angle and perception. So we swim through aspects of the ego as a human being and are forced to reckon with the expression of such until we choose to see outside of those boundaries. Truth penetrates that veil of understanding and really allows for greater influence of centered awareness and spirit, as above, so below. And the soul is seen as that spark of the spirit that infuses the body with life. So we're looking towards a harmony that induces a flourishing of sorts. We're looking towards core unification and communication of all parts of self and that which we identify with. And those states that we reside in will mirror themselves in our electromagnetic field. So every energy body is a distinct self-regulating universe. And in order to transcend internally and as a collective, we need to be balanced. And balance is achieved in a different manner for every person. It will look different in every being. And the traits held there, they can hold space in certain regions of the body, or they can have more of a full-bodied effect. Those energies could be stagnant, heightened, faint, dispersed, sedated, excessive, etc. So the energy field, as we measure it on the physical plane, is mixtures of kinetic energy, which results from motion, thermal energy relating to heat, chemicals, so substances or compounds of substances. Nuclear energy involves the splitting of atoms, electrostatic, dealing with electric charges and currents, magnetic forces that are going to attract and repel, sonic waves, so sound vibration and waves of pressure. And then we have within that range more subtle energies. These are not so easily measured, but they do respond to intention. This is a very intelligent force, a conscious force. And within that category, we have acupuncture points, meridians, chakras, auric bodies. This is our bridging between spirit and matter. Everything is composed of vibration, so physicists have found matter to actually be completely mutable, and on the subatomic level, matter does not actually exist with certainty in any kind of definite place, but it rather shows a tendency to exist. So technically all particles can be transmuted into other particles. And these subtle energies, they are non-local in effect, meaning that every cell is connected to all others and unaffected by time and space or distance. This is a universal language, far beyond verbal cues. It's a blueprint that guides our evolution. Energetic bodies contain high amounts of electricity, so every cell in the body stores and emits electricity. There's that movement of protons and electrons, impulses of memories and thoughts and feelings. This is a neural networking similar to the way the brain functions. So memory is encoded in an energy system just as it is chemically encoded in neurons. It's like a storage space of sorts. Your electromagnetic field holds information related to your experience, past, present, future. And there are also high amounts of electromagnetism, and this is within our surroundings as well. We have radio waves, microwaves, infrared light, visible light, ultraviolet light, X-rays, gamma waves. So radiation is absorbed by matter as a particle. So photons are light or electromagnetic radiation. And polarity, when we're talking of this, we have negative, positive. The left side of the body tends to be more of that yin draw, the right side more of the yang. This is similar to that is produced within crystals. And polarity, this magnetic pole can also be observed in the north and south poles of the physical form, or of a living being, I should say. But polarity exists so as to create differentiation, and that takes place in the body and also within our interaction with our surroundings. So through a series of polarized contacts with people and our environment, balance is achieved. And also, interesting fact, all life forms contain tiny crystals of magnetite, and this continually registers changes in one's relationship to the Earth's electromagnetic field and helps orient that being to the field. So the concentration of these crystals is actually significantly more in animals and helps them with navigation. So we are limited in what we are able to sense, but this does not mean that the energy does not exist. So we are intrinsically surrounded by these fields of vibration, and the more that our senses are brought into a coherent relationship, the more available those higher states of mind become. So the resultant synchronistic relationship that occurs between the senses helps harmonize them into that sort of whole brain state of experience, which frees the brain from the need to further analyze sensory input, which is helpful for meditative purposes, and that centered space also relays into enhanced intuition. So we're not limited by the five senses that we are familiar with. There is a remarkable spectrum of senses that have already been identified by scientists. I think more than 50 have been categorized, and that list is continually growing. So our intuitive abilities have tended to atrophy over time because they are not pursued and developed at a young age. So I think it's important that we learn to reactivate these abilities into our awareness. But we're certainly not limited to the types of radiation that I mentioned in the previous slide. And even the spectrum shown in this image is not the full gamut. This is only a small fraction of what is universally available. So, as you can see, we can only perceive an even smaller amount of that radiation with the naked eye. Radio waves, these are the longest wavelengths in the electromagnetic spectrum, often used for communication. Microwaves, these are going to be a little bit shorter than radio waves, but longer than infrared, used for radar, also communication, and as a heating element. Infrared is just greater than that of the red end of the visible light spectrum, often used for cameras, body heat patterns, and as a therapy, it's used to improve circulation of oxygen-rich blood and helps promote healing. The ultraviolet is more of that invisible part of the spectrum. X-rays are electromagnetic waves of high energy and shorter length. They pass through material and are absorbed to various degrees. And last but not least, gamma. This is similar to the X-rays. Almost all cosmic gamma rays are actually blocked by the Earth's atmosphere, but the brain does produce a series of gamma waves at times. So we do have assessment tools that we can use to more or less gauge our field. And one of these being electrodes. This helps us find small points of conductivity that usually those points flow along longer pathways. So I'm referencing acupuncture points and meridians here. And electrodes also aid in finding those corresponding internal organs that relate very specifically to a particular meridian. We also have instrumentation that can register light and color to various degrees within our field. And of course, these shifts are going to coincide with our state of being. So energetic realizations occur due to changing cognitive and emotional relays, and they precede those physiological measures often, which can, in reading one's field, this can help anticipate illness before those symptoms take effect. And there is direct connection here in multiple studies. Clairvoyant readers, which clairvoyancy is a faculty of perceiving something beyond normal sensory contact, but those readers could detect characteristics of the field and those transitions that would occur before there was any physiological change that was measured by instruments. So, some of those measurements could include galvanic skin response, which that is a change in the electrical resistance of the skin, usually due to emotional stress. Brain waves, blood pressure, heart rate, muscle contraction, all of these things can be measured and correspond with shifts that are occurring in the field. But we're also looking for the quality of energy that's present in the field. So pulsations of a more chaotic quality are going to usually indicate a disturbance of some kind. And this results in the field taking on more extremes in temperature, density, brightness, fluidity, and these things can also be picked up on using intuitive perception. The hands also are a good tool for this. We also have applied kinesiology, and this is energy testing muscle strength that is correlating with electrical activity in the nervous system. So a positive high energy field will manifest as that muscle strength, and a negative low energy response within our field will register as muscle weakness. So this is an attunement to the body's understanding. We're finding what resonates and what does not. So, our beliefs, our expectations, preconceptions, we often have a bias that can influence those results. So sometimes it's beneficial to have another person test your body. But the body's health truly reflects the health and integrity and the flow of our energy body, which very directly ties into our spiritual health, our mental emotional health. And as a culture, I think we have a bit of a superiority complex of thinking. As humans, we think we know much more than we actually do. And our surrounding culture affirms its own intellect, but I feel that it really negates our primal sense of knowing. But we are consistently contributing and likewise swayed by not just our own frame of mind, but by the overall health of the planet, by collective consciousness, and by planetary, environmental, and psychological factors. Our surrounding fields of energy are experienced at all times. So, the appearance of our field contains an assortment of light, color, texture, sound, weaving, pattern, shape. These are in constant interplay and in constant connection to the body and the mind. And it pulsates. Our electromagnetic fields breathe. Breathwork is amazingly crucial, not just for our lung system, but that life force that animates our physical bodies is regulated by breath, and that breath energy is controlled by the mind in many ways. So our field can take on a more open, spacious, rhythmic, or bright form, or in a more distorted sort of realm, it can become disordered or scrambled, chaotic. The more secured and concentrated we are on a thought or intention, the more thoroughly it resounds. So it becomes more apparent, more absolute. The intensity and definition really do depend on the clarity of that form as it hits your system. So we're looking at stagnancy versus activation, dormancy versus stirring or fueling a certain notion or idea. So we don't always reach points of manifestation. Sometimes our ideas and constructs are never brought about, but they do attract one another, and especially in a groupthink or group mentality, the effects of these notions are amplified. Those ideas will reverberate faster and stronger, and truly the ability of an intention to manifest itself is directly proportional to the quality of its expression. So we are very much responsible for how we participate in this life cycle and what we consciously feed, because this does funnel into greater collective complexes at play. And because our senses within our field become so meshed into one another, if you will. In certain states of mind, they begin to become indistinct from one another. Our senses simultaneously perceive phenomenon, so we may hear light or see sound, for instance. Also, these type of sensory input can join objects such as letters, numbers, shapes, or names with a certain sensory perception such as smell, color, or flavor. So our neural patterns, when we're working with these, we're usually working to reprogram the way the body responds to stress, responds to our life experience, and in doing so, we are usually rehabitualizing and retraining the psyche in certain manners. So individuals tend to feel safest in whatever is considered their norm, whether or not it is actually the collective norm, quote unquote. And these inclinations are often established in childhood, but they can also be established at any point in life. When we want to instigate change, we have to work with the parts of our psyche that have registered in a particular way, so formed certain complexes because of what we have encountered in life through our experience. So we have to consciously establish a new norm for ourselves, and we are often required to reassess previous states of mind that might have labeled a particular stimulus or experience as a threat to our well-being. And remember, this is all taken in subjectively, right? So it's important to recenter one's perspective in looking at a situation more objectively and establishing a release of a stress pattern by implementing new patterns. So when there is no sentient change in the present moment to reset the controls, the next moment will be more or less a repeat of the last one, and only when acted on in the present can true and lasting change be achieved. So by embodying peace and forgiveness, compassion, those higher virtues, either in relation to the self or to another. So as we are adapting to stress, the mind is organizing these neural arrangements, psychoactive codings of sorts, as a means of ensuring our survival and reminding us of potential risks. This is for the benefit of our health. And most of the time, these stressors are tied to life lessons critical to the maturation of our soul. So many habits are formed at a young age, and a great deal of one's tendencies stem from the atmosphere created by those parent figures. And illness and disorder can be implications of some kind of inner affliction or distorted complex that is formed. So these feelings are going to be specific to an individual, and they can often be directly connected to an isolated event or perhaps sequence of events. And some events may be seemingly unrelated, but will capture a comparable theme. So look for those reoccurring issues, and there's rhyme and reason for where a blockage or illness houses itself in the body. So it's not random. There is biological significance in that psychological expression, and it's good to see people as a soul on its journey back home to the true self, the God self. And disease is just one of the ways to point the traveler in the right direction. So, with the meridian system, this is basically like an energetic circulatory system of sorts, similar to the blood and lymph circulatory systems in the body. The consensus is that there are 14 major pathways, at least, that carry energy into, through, and outside of the body, obviously subsurface to the body as well. Each of these segments is of a single pathway. So to be clear, 12 of these 14 segments are connected together. They feed into one another. And 2 are a bit more separated out and form the vertical center line of the body. So they can be stimulated through pressure to release or redistribute energy. There are hundreds of tiny reservoirs of heat and electromagnetism and subtle light energies, and acupuncture points are triggered along the surface of the skin and usually lie along these meridian pathways, almost like a connect the dots sort of thing. But they're not entirely stable in their shape, size, or location. This depends on the individual, and you might have to kind of feel it out. But they're named for the primary organ or system that it feeds. So this doesn't necessarily mean that the meridian will physically run through that same organ that it nourishes or controls, maintains. But meridians are capable of, they read, they code, and transmit information from one part of the body to another. And of course, this heavily impacts other biological processes that are occurring. It provides us an underlying template for the physical body. So the yin meridians flow in the anterior spaces of the body, and anteriorly up the front towards the head, so working with more earthly energy in that way. And the yang meridians flow superficial or exterior to the body and posteriorly down the back towards the feet, so pulling from more of that spiritual domain. So this is just another feature of our electromagnetic framework. Neither yin nor yang is absolute or static. Each is going to contain the beginning point of the other aspect, so they are very interdependent on one another. And they can be applied in many ways, but the general tone of yin is more passive, it's more feminine, it's cooler, it's darker, and yang energy is a bit more active, it's more masculine, it's warmer, it's brighter. So here we have a list of the 14 major meridians and a diagram of how they fall along the body. Like I mentioned, meridians may not necessarily flow through the muscle or organ that it affects. However, in the human embryo, each meridian does flow through its associated muscle or organ, and each meridian is also influenced, or rather characterized, by an element or season. So fire, water, earth, metal, or wood. And this was coined in such a way by ancient civilizations in the East many years ago, but health is essentially seen as a harmonious balance of all of these elements, and the chi of these elements waxes and wanes in daily and seasonal cycles. A little more about meridians. There are balancing techniques that one can use to help resituate the field in a way. Tracing being one of these. This is following a meridian along its natural course. So it's a strengthening mechanism. Or one could stimulate opposite of the meridian's natural flow, and this is going to have a more calming, sedating sort of effect. And flushing, this involves both that backwards and forwards motion along that pathway. You could twist certain points along the meridian, apply stretches, massage, hold, tap. All of these things are going to bring about effect, usually a positive effect. And essentially, we are stabilizing the segments in doing these things, helping dispense the energy into more equivalent portions. So each meridian also has an alarm point, and these tend to lie on the front and side of the torso. So there's one for each of the 12 meridians. And these points may not lie directly on their associated meridian, but they are the most significant testing points for each meridian in terms of weak or strong flow. And they will usually be found within region of the meridian's correlated organ. Neurolymphatic points, these are reflex points. They will help stimulate release of toxins, and of course are going to work a little more closely with cleansing the lymph system. Neurovascular points, these are reflex points as well, primarily on the head. They are like a neurological switch that helps activate blood flow related to organs and glands. And like I mentioned earlier, strengthening points, these are going to be adding energy to the flow of the meridian. Sedating points are going to be more for the release of excess energy. So our Earth, too, has a meridian system or grid system. And now the Earth's longitude and latitude lines, they are imaginary. However, there is still meridian-like circuitry. And although they may or may not exactly follow what humans have designated as our grid, they do exist and are probably in a similar stance. I would also like to note that there are definitely hot spots comparable to acupuncture points on the body, where there are significantly higher levels of electromagnetic radiation, and coincidentally, many spiritual centers and monuments have been built at these locations over the course of world history. So the grid system is very much influenced by Earth's rhythms. We have periods of calm in the Earth's magnetic field that tend to correspond with a heightening of sensitivities such as telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition. We are influenced by the moon-sun cycles, cycles of our star system, cycles of the galaxy, daily cycles, monthly, yearly cycles, astrological ages, spiritual cycles. This list continues. There are many universal rhythms. We also have assigned time zones, so it is important to study your body's circuitry when you're traveling, in particular because you are entering into slightly different energetic domains. So it's sort of like reverting yourself to a different point in a cycle. And that can temporarily throw your system off. It takes a moment to adjust. But I do find there to be a resemblance in the way we divvy up the human body's meridians into elements, and the way that the Earth is influenced seasonally, depending on the region. Although the Earth is more proportionally concentric, and our bodies, which, they're still balanced in their own way, they do deviate more in their form. So while there are parallels, we're looking at the makeup of two very different living beings. But I would assume that there are meridians outside of the planet and also subsurface to the planet with those similar yin and yang attributes. Here we have a meridian flow wheel, and this is similar to an around-the-clock maintenance system of sorts. It follows a circadian or daily rhythm. So the energy of each meridian and its influenced organ is going to be strongest for a specific 2-hour increment each day. And there are also alternating 4-hour patterns of yin and yang energy throughout the day, as you can see here. So as each meridian comes into its highest action, the paired meridian on the opposite side of the wheel will conversely be at its lowest. So, for instance, if the triple warmer meridian, which is of yang nature, is overcharged, then the spleen, which is of yin nature, will be undercharged. So each pair has complementary and oppositional sort of features. So it's kind of like a balancing act. The word chakra means disc, vortex, or wheel. So chakras rotate in a funnel-like motion, and there are major and minor centers. With the major center line, there are 7 of these that pull up from the pelvic region towards the top of the head. And these are the more familiar compounded energetic organizations. There are the minor centers as well. And technically, there are hundreds of these more complex circuitries, little mini circuitries that are a part of our form. Some of the more major ones of the minor centers are located at bone joint areas of the body, but they overlap and envelop one another and essentially work together to allow full body functionality. So all of the information contained in these spaces can be tied to both this lifetime and any past life. So this is soul history, not just current history. But these are energy stations of memories, thoughts, emotions, obstacles, vulnerabilities, desires, tendencies, habits, physical conditions related to the psyche, personality traits, biological adaptations, and heritage. And they envelop energies of tissues or organs within proximity as well. And also relate to specific themes. So the alignment of these centers and their development occur with spiritual and psychological maturation. So there is ideally an evolution of self as we progress in a lifetime. So as a means of processing our environment and our experience, we occupy these subjective understandings, and this further reverberates into our physical reality. And so we will often be presented different catalysts to help encourage various realms of growth. Our field portrays a response to our environment, and it still maintains more consistent energetic tiers as well. So those of more cosmological or astrological influence, or information that relates to the soul. So continuing with chakras, they do contain layers. There are about 7 layers in each center. 7 seems to be the magic number. And with the top layers, these are going to be more recent personal history. They're going to be more susceptible to moment-to-moment or daily change, seasonal change. And those deeper layers, they are going to be sturdier, clearer, more consistent. And they may vary in color and density from that typical rainbow sequence. They may contain more images, more stories, more past life history. So the centers will reflect the energies that the person is born into, as well as the life as it is lived. And interesting side note here. In a number of cases, there have been children that reported highly specific details, confirmed by investigators, about another person whose identity they are experiencing, so past life memories. And in 35% of these cases, the children actually had birthmarks that matched the wounds that the other person had received. So there are some seemingly measurable ways of tying people to past versions of themselves. But here I would also like to bring up the Akashic Records, and this domain is specific to Earth's collective consciousness, and it too is like a memory bank, but all individuals participating in Earth's cycle have the ability to access that, and therefore would technically be able to access certain details about someone's life if they felt so inclined, but that does require pretty heavy attunement. But you can see here that there are symbols representing each space. So each center is symbolically interpreted, and this can be used to help access or focus on a particular center. But remember that each space is far more intricate geometrically than merely these images. So I want to talk for a minute on the mechanics of chakras. On one end, they can pull energy from the environment and distribute it throughout the body, and this allows it to take on a counterclockwise rotation. It can also send energy out into our surrounding space, and this has a clockwise rotation. So the difference here is a more internalized versus externalized way of processing information. Some people view this as a center being opened or closed, but both are actually manners of integration and both are necessary. The body has roughly half of its centers rotating clockwise and the other half rotating counterclockwise in any given moment. And additionally, different layers within the chakra could be spinning in opposite directions, but there does tend to be a more dominant pull over the center, one way or the other. But it is possible for a center to be simultaneously pulling in energy and sending out energy. In fact, most of the time it is doing both. So as far as the characteristics of the center go, we take into consideration the shape. Is it circular? Is it elliptical? If so, is it more polarized to the left or the right? If it's linear, is it horizontal or vertical? We look at velocity or speed. Is it slow? Is it fast? Lethargic? Active? We look at the breadth, the scope. How wide is that rotation? We look at the direction of the rotation. And all of these things can give you ideas about the current state of the center. So one can intuitively gauge the condition of a chakra, of course, but brief assessments can also be made using a pendulum for guidance, dowsing. As far as light and color go, these centers vary not just in hue, but in their properties. There's a variance in meaning, and while they do display fundamental tendencies, they are as unique as a thumbprint. They're very relative to the individual. The colors of the 7 main chakras don't necessarily follow your typical rainbow outline provided in mainstream culture. Some centers are a little more fluid and variable, while others are more solid, more stable. And these two states tend to alternate as one moves up that column, back and forth between each center, and can also indicate which centers are more mentally or emotionally focused. So some carry that more stable tone or color, while others occupy an array of colors. And science tells us that light energy makes up about 99%, maybe even 100, of the body's atoms and cells. So, with chakra therapy, this typically involves a syncing up of different regions of the body, encouraging fluent dialogue between these systems, tissues, layers, centers, mental faculties, and this is primarily done through the use of the hands. So we can use still hands as a means of holding space for one's field, and this can yield very beneficial results. In fact, it may be one of the more powerful methods. And in using these balancing techniques, the idea is that the individual is consciously fueling his or her field. So some of the more common reasons for using this modality would include acceleration of healing, reduction of pain, can aid in relaxation or release, help provide healthy equilibrium, so soothe and harmonize. But it does require that you concurrently work with the psyche. So, as a therapist, I could technically move energy around all day, but there would be a risk of it pulling back if the individual is not undergoing true internal shifts. So, also as a means of accentuating a session and creating an atmosphere. These are not necessary things, but it can be helpful to employ essential oils, crystals, sound and vibration, other objects of significance, etc. And of course, breath work is crucial. One can scan, sweep, smooth, magnetize, or pump. And all of these things are done using the hands. So this is primarily done within range of the body or via light touch. So the purpose is not to directly control or force the energy, but instead to guide it and allow the body to proceed as it needs to. The spiritual body is incredibly more wise than we can grasp with our human minds, so it's important that we let it run its course as it needs to. We can't always use logic or our thinking minds to figure something out. No two individuals will need the same healing recipe, quote unquote, if you will. But we are looking towards a shifting and psychological perspective. So as you change internally, you will see these energetic nodes transform. And a couple fun facts semi-related to this topic. There was a study done in which seeds were grown in water treated by healers, and they were seen to be much more likely to sprout, reach a greater height, have greater chlorophyll content. So intention is huge. There's another study, and after being instructed in how to use visualization to inhibit the breakdown of red blood cells in a test tube that was located in a different room, there were subjects that achieved statistically significant results in their efforts to slow the rate of cell deterioration, and this is simply with conscious effort. There's another study, and with mental focus alone, people were able to increase the electron activity within a generator. So never underestimate what your mind-body-spirit complex is capable of. So here we have a list of the 7 major chakras as they fall along the center line of the body. And the lower centers are going to be more physically based, and those higher centers are more spiritually oriented. So this influences how our experience and how our psychological constructs are held in the body and where. The correlated phrases under each center relate to the realization that occurs within each space. And as simply as they are stated, they actually have very profound and in-depth meaning to the self, and this really takes time to fully develop. So, for example, the root chakra focuses on realms of existing and being, the sacral chakra around realms of feeling, the solar plexus around manners of doing, the heart chakra centers around love and compassion. The throat center fixates more so on expression. The pituitary or third eye center centralizes more on that abstract sense of sight. And the pineal or crown chakra is directed more towards deep states of knowing. So each of these centers governs physical portions of the body as well, and this is dependent on positioning. So for instance, the root center may express on behalf of the feet and legs, while the solar plexus will display happenings with the liver, the stomach, the intestines, the spleen, the gallbladder, or the pancreas, etc. So I'd like to delve a bit more into the general characteristics of the chakras, starting with the root. This is primarily pulling in earthly energy, so those grounding and stabilizing forces. This is a more direct source of nourishment, so inclusive of food, water, oxygen, etc. But more than that, it pertains to our connection to the planet in terms of the environment and how we have adapted specifically to the atmospheric conditions here, Earth's electromagnetic field, and the way in which we follow patterns of Earth's organic makeup. So this plays into primitive and innate qualities, those more animalistic in nature, and this bridges into our ancestral past and evolutionary considerations. We're also looking at cultural identity, so our sense of belonging and bonding, our security, our attachment as a member of a collective. So basically our identity as it pertains to our community and those practices and ideologies in place, etc. So we're also looking at the basic needs of individuals, the fundamentals of survival, what is being met, is one being supported and provided for, do they have adequate means of living, job-wise, money-wise, do they have access to shelter. So for instance, one may feel a lack of support from others, someone may feel unable to support his or herself, or that he or she cannot support those that they care about. We're looking at protection, safety in your space, and fairness. Are you residing in a domain with a just system in place? What kinds of laws or rulings are in place? And traumas related to this center often revolve around abandonment or loss of order, perhaps feeling stuck. This would be more circumstantial, or threats to physical longevity. And I would like to note that each center also monitors a specific endocrine gland. And for the root, I have heard it more often connected to the adrenals, but I've also seen the adrenals linked to the sacral center. So the sacral chakra is a region of heavy emotion. It's a space of feeling and of sensory perceptions, such as comfort, pleasure, creativity, imagination, passion, etc. We're looking at the sexual nature of an individual and childlike aspects of his or her being, so playfulness, youthfulness, instinct, inspiration. We're looking at how one relates to others and what connections are established. So, how we honor other forms of life via respect and recognition. So, basically, personal codes of conduct, more or less. Thinking on what kind of a role we play in others' lives and vice versa. And associated traumas with this center tend to involve procreation or sexual conflict, gender, loss, betrayal, addictions of various types. And the affiliated endocrine glands for this space are the gonads or the sexual organs. So the solar plexus chakra is a power center. It's a center of confidence, of strength, and personal transformation, self-control, responsibility. So this is how we proceed to maintain ourselves. We're looking at self-interpretation. So how is it that we view ourselves? One is our self-value, self-worth, self-esteem. Do we have autonomous progressions in thought? So this works with becoming more individualistic and independent as a person, which requires us to reassess what we have previously been taught and try to reintegrate those ideas with a new mind or new personal standpoint. We're also looking at self-care. How do we manage our health? Self-fulfillment. What kind of meaning do we derive from life? Have we found our place? Where do we fit in? And traumas related to this center often involve concepts of inadequacy or our perceived failures, rejection, resistance, identity conflicts, or one's inability to process information. So, as you can see, some of these psychological complexes will carry similar resonance to literal physical complexes. So, for example, someone's solar plexus center may experience a blockage if, let's say, that person eats food that is spoiled or unhealthy and they subsequently cannot metabolize it, or if that person is not able to quote-unquote stomach or process a particular notion or incident that may have occurred, then this can happen as well. And lastly, the endocrine gland for this center is the pancreas. So the heart actually has a nervous system all of its own and makes decisions independent of the brain. So the electrical wave produced by a beating heart has about 50 times the amplitude and about 1,000 times the strength of a brain wave. So this is significant because we put a lot of emphasis on the brain, and rightly so, but the heart is absolutely astounding and it reverberates with a lot of vigor. I think it's one of the most influential and critical spaces in our form. It's a channel of love, of affection and desire. It's a place of nurturing values. We're also looking at self-compassion and how this is reflected empathetically towards others through understanding and appreciation and forgiveness. We're looking at self-harmony. So, do we have congruent accordance within ourselves? Are we conscientious, responsive, and are we a healing presence, not just for ourselves, but for others as well? Traumas related to this chakra could include apathy, neglect, sorrow, so grief or hopelessness, sensations of being overwhelmed, or territorial scares or panic. And the endocrine gland related to this center is the thymus. So the throat chakra primarily deals with communication. So how are we vocalizing or giving of ourselves, and are we listening and receiving in the same capacity? So this helps us navigate truth. Are we assimilating messages with awareness and sensitivity? And are we further exercising caution in criticism or judgment of others? We're also looking at self-expression and the radiation of our spirit, as well as our sense of self within society. So what is our influence on our surroundings? What is it that we are emanating outwards from our space? What is our responsibility to our community? We're also looking at divine will and authority, so really surrendering to the breakdown of the self. In order to implement change, there will be a bit of backtracking and then a rebuilding process that occurs. And how are we reorienting ourselves towards more spiritually inclined directives as opposed to what we think we may want for ourselves? And traumas encompassed in this area may be related to anxiety, self-doubt, or guilt, or one's inability to comprehend or accept information. And the endocrine gland connected to this center is the thyroid. So the third eye chakra is focused more on an internalized projection of divine nature. So we're looking at symbolic insight, and with that, intuitive discernment and clarity of mind, a more abstract sense of self. We're perceiving concepts on a broader scale and thus revealing illusion. We're also dealing with higher alignment. So are we manifesting our visions and intentions? And are we expanding towards more ideal and mature versions of ourselves? We're also looking at mirrored reflections. So it is a common practice for humans to not only project their personal issues on other people, but we also have a greater tendency to encounter polarities in others that represent something within ourselves. We're also dealing with celestial love and spiritual ecstasy. So this is a love that extends much further beyond ourselves and our immediate sources of devotion. So we're looking at unifying principles of oneness. And a blockage in this center could ensue from distorted viewpoints or subconscious shadows, so that which we are not aware of or choose to not bring to light. And the endocrine gland connected to this space is the pituitary gland. The crown chakra houses aspects of our transcendental states of being, so looking at divine wisdom and comprehension. This is sort of a gateway to spiritual intervention and a connection to source or higher consciousness. We're also looking at synchronicity of the mind-body-spirit unit and a fusion of purpose here. We focus on ultimate presence and how we as co-creative life forces contribute to this presence, how we inhabit faith and higher knowing that all is sacred. If one is not attuned to this center, it could be due to spiritual disengagement or a disassociation from self for various reasons. And the endocrine gland for this center is the pineal. And interestingly enough, pineal cells have a photosensory function, serving to receive light, similar to the retinal cells in the eye. So the aura is basically one's entire collective biofield, and this is inclusive of chakras, meridians, acupuncture points, and much more. It's a multi-layered sphere of energy that emanates from the body, and interacts with the fields of other living beings and the atmosphere of the earth, and really all other quantum fields in general. And because we are connected to all other conscious life, especially on this planet, telepathic communications are certainly a possibility, and they do happen frequently, if even unintentionally at times. The aura is a protective force comparable to an antenna. It filters encountered energies, draws in necessary energies, and further dispenses unnecessary energies. It also carries and transmits information similar to how a hologram operates. So a hologram is a physical structure that diffracts light into an image. So every part of a hologram contains the image of the full object. So any one fraction of one's auric field includes information pertaining to the whole being. And similar to the constituents of the chakra system, the aura consists of waveforms, light energies, colors, geometric patterns, polarities, electricity, electromagnetic energies, etc. The aura surrounds and permeates all living systems, and even inanimate objects can hold energy and impress upon their environment. So that includes buildings and homes as well. Structures and their relative points in space can actually tap into old resonant fields. So remember that the quantum realm supersedes linear time. But of course, forms with a conscious spark of life are going to be many times more animated than those without. So, like I've mentioned, the aura is corresponding with changes that occur in the body, mind, and environment. It is processing trauma, so it's like a shock absorber of sorts. But the aura is primarily a personal veil from which we view our surroundings. So it's also processing everyday life, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a stress factor. But remember that a healthy amount of tension, or tug, or polarity, is what keeps us on our toes and in motion. So I think it's a huge part of someone's drive, and it's not always linked to negative emotion. There are 7 recognized layers in the aura, and each succeeding layer interpenetrates completely all of the layers under it. So I'm going to cover the 7 layers of the aura, but the aura as we know it contains about 7 bands, starting with the physical body or unit. This centers around autonomic functioning, and the autonomic nervous system is a control system that acts largely in an unconscious manner. So this includes both parasympathetic and sympathetic functioning, parasympathetic being more restorative in nature, and sympathetic being more on guard. So this is our defense system. And the 7 bodies that stretch beyond this point are profoundly similar to the chakra system and the organization of characteristics within each region. So the etheric body is the first layer. It is connected with the root chakra and lies closest to the physical body and represents the physical body and all accompanying systems and tissues. So this layer is typically stronger in athletes and those who are especially active or physically well balanced, and weaker in those who may lead a more sedentary lifestyle or when one's health or immunity is compromised. It is the easiest layer to see with the naked eye. It carries a bluish gray color in its domain. And fun fact, all living organisms are said to have that surrounding blue tint, and that is even why some say the sky is blue. But the etheric body pulsates around 20 cycles per second, so this is equivalent to 20 hertz, and consists of large waveforms and produces a very low bass sound. So we encounter those faster and thus higher pulsations as we continue into succeeding layers of the auric body. So this is comparable also to the tiered resonance of the chakra system. And the emotional body, this is the second layer. It is connected to the sacral chakra, and it represents feelings. It can also harbor emotional stress, and it tends to be multicolored in its form. The mental body is the third layer, and this is connected to the solar plexus chakra. It represents thoughts, cognitive processing, state of mind, etc. And for this reason is said to radiate strongest around the head, neck, and shoulder region of the body. It also tends to be yellow in color. And the astral body, this is the fourth layer. It is connected to the heart chakra and represents how we form relational ties to others. So it becomes stronger through intimate and loving connections and weaker during breakups or relational conflicts. And this layer is often pink or rosy in color. So the etheric template, this is the fifth layer. It's connected to the throat chakra and represents the entire blueprint of the body that exists on the physical plane. So this includes everything you create on a physical level, including your identity, personality, overall demeanor, etc. And it is healed and made stronger by expressing your truth and knowing who you are. And this layer varies in color. And the celestial body is the sixth layer. It is connected to the third eye chakra and represents connection to the divine and all other living beings. So it signifies unconditional love and unifying feelings. And a strong resonation within this center may enable greater abilities in communicating with the spirit world and receiving messages. And it is often seen to be pearly white in color. And last but not least, we have the etheric template. This is the seventh layer, and it is connected to the crown chakra. So it vibrates at a very high frequency. It rapidly pulsates. And it represents spiritual wisdom and universal oneness, as well as holding information related to the soul. It tends to reside in a tone of gold, and you can often find this layer situated about 2 to 3 feet from the physical body. So as you can see in this picture, there are multiple layers beyond even these 7. However, the further you continue out, the higher and more advanced the vibratory patterns become, and this makes them much harder to access, especially in this dimensional realm. So these images, of course, are drawings, but they do give you a better idea of what each layer looks like in a general sense, at least. So you can see that the first, third, fifth, and seventh layers are more mentally focused and therefore are more monotoned. And the second, fourth, and sixth layers are more emotionally tied and thus have a wider variety of color and heavier texture. So the general state of one's being and or specific parcels of one's being can be picked up upon through focused awareness. So some people are born with heightened perception and can naturally read a person's field or see visual emanations. But for the rest of us, it is something we have to further develop because we don't grow up being told to take notice of these things. And kids typically are more intuitive than adults in certain manners. It really does behoove those who are taught young. And relaxed concentration is going to be essential when attuning to the spirit of another, because you need to remain open yet attentive to these metaphysical properties and what is being communicated from there. So, like I've said before, a strong, wholesome field will be cohesive, stable, bright, clear, and it will give an air of beauty. So, it will be well formed, well organized. And conversely, someone who is in disarray may have a more frazzled looking field. So, when your psyche takes on heavy emotion or stress, the field often responds with muddied, darker toned, disjointed, or messy kinds of energy. And the appearance of these energetic imbalances could result in a thinning of the field, disorganization, a collapsed looking form, tears, leaks, lesions, stagnation, or lack of flow. And basically, all of the same techniques used for the chakras can also be applied here. So, when attempting to balance one's field, we can scan, fluff, massage, weave. We can follow a Celtic weaving pattern, which would include energetic spinning, curving, spiraling, twisting, crisscross motions. And this is especially helpful when working with the healing of an injury. So, this can be done consciously or with the hands. But keep in mind, the field will also be working towards those points of renewal. But as individuals, we can certainly enhance that process and allow for faster progression. So I like to use a series of figure eights because our field as a whole is a grid system. It's like quantum connective tissue, if you will. And these methods would also be beneficial for people who suffer from phantom limb syndrome. This is very real because electrical signals do remain even after a part of the body has been cut away. So, through the methods of Kirlian photography, people have actually been able to photograph images of the remains of a field after a portion of its physical unit was taken away. So, this specific study involved pictures of leaves after they had been cut away. So, we're entering into the 5 rhythms. And this is a template that organizes natural phenomenon into 5 master groups or patterns. And the ordering of the elements and seasons here are relative to one another, so that water corresponds with winter, wood or air with spring, and so forth. And as humans, we are each understood to be a balance and unique dynamic of these components. So while all 5 elements are present in every person, there tend to be one or more elements that form a more prevalent personal rhythm. And each element, too, is going to have certain strengths and vulnerabilities. So, while we are influenced by the arrangement of the stars, and especially at our time of birth, I think this does affect aspects of our personality, but so much of our environment and experience can create tendencies as well. So, the characteristics of each element or season can be swayed from both nurture and nature. Each element is also going to exert dominance over another element, but is also dominated by another element, as can be seen relationally in this image. So these 5 elements are the basis of Chinese metaphysics and philosophy, and they also have practical applications in feng shui, astrology, and traditional Chinese medicine. And I would like to also reference the 3 doshas in the Indian Vedic system. These are biological energies connected to the human body and mind, similar to these rhythms. They are Vata, which is air, space, Pitta, which is fire, and Kapha, which is earth and water. And overall demeanor is based on an individual's unique constitution of these dosha energies. So there are different ways of categorizing these elements, as you will continue to see, and even more arrangements out there that attempt to classify people's inclined ways of being. So this is just another way of dividing the cosmos into elemental energies, these being specific to Earth. So take this information with a grain of salt. The point being that we are an extension and a reproduction of the quantum space we are a part of, and there are concepts and ideas represented on all scales of reality, both physical and metaphysical. So life is full of contrast and individualism, but this is what colors the world. There is definitely a musical accordance that takes place amongst living beings. So, in continuing with the 5 rhythms, we're looking at elements and seasons, but we're also relating this to phases or cycles that a human may go through in a lifetime. So these are vibratory imprints or frameworks that affect physical attributes, health patterns and challenges, personality traits, character, temperament, etc. They can affect one's speech, the way he or she walks, really the general way a person carries themselves. An individual will connect especially to those people, environments, and activities whose rhythm corresponds or harmonizes well with their own. And I mentioned on the last slide that each element dominates over another, but is also dominated by another. So the 5 overcoming interactions are melting, penetrating, separating, absorbing, and quenching. So for example, fire melts metal, metal penetrates wood, wood separates earth, earth absorbs water, and water quenches fire. And this idea can be further applied as we look at the way people interact and their relationships. So these seasonal descriptions are literal, but they can also represent what a particular period of someone's life looks like or entails. So with winter, we're focusing on embryos and planting seeds that hold potential, ensuring and setting ourselves up for a future. This is a beginning stage of fresh spirit. And it's a time to be reflective and introspective, restful, restorative. With spring, we are looking at new growth and those seedlings bursting forth, the power and insistence of new life. So a blooming and a flourishing is occurring here. With summer, we are looking at notions being fulfilled, ideas and events coming to fruition. There's a richness of the moment. So it's a time of transformation, energy, enthusiasm, passion. And with the solstice, or equinox, this is also called Indian summer, this is a time of transition and of harvest. There's an assimilation of change. So we're looking towards stabilization as we enter into new passages. And the solstice also holds both the past and future in the present moment. And lastly, we have autumn. This is an ending stage that embodies completion and meaning found in attainment. It's a time to cleanse and detox yourself. And any of these elements can be excessive in manner, and that could lead to extreme behaviors or intense attributes. But on the other hand, one could also be emptied or devoid of a capability. And we reflect this interplay in the way that we act and think. So remember that it is necessary to navigate spectrums and personal equilibrium, because we're not just here to be cosmically controlled in that way. While some tendencies may be more astrologically persuaded and hold weight long term, we may still end up residing in differing spaces of these elements within ourselves in distinct phases of life. And this is similar to the way that our field has those layers that more rapidly fluctuate and those that are more unchanging. And you can see also that I've added ether as another element sometimes included in this categorization, and also each element's correlated sensory input. So water relates to taste, and those who resonate with this element are typically more empathetic, creative, emotional, spiritual, and intuitive. Fire is related to sight and is linked often to those who are more enthusiastic, impulsive, inspirational, humorous, and expressive or dramatic. Earth relates to touch, and those who connect with the earth element are usually more grounded, practical, disciplined, and stable or firm. Those associated with metal are generally more decisive, concentrated, ambitious, authoritative, and uncompromising. Air is related to smell and holds relevancy for those who are more curious, independent, talkative, more entertaining, and intellectual. And ether is related to hearing as a sense. So another variation of the 5 rhythms revolves around movement, and I like how this was divvied up. Initially we're looking at a state of flow and inner truth, so the impulse of being true to oneself, listening attentively, being receptive. This space could be described as supple, flexible, and surrendered. We have staccato, which is a space of power, and it carries more of a masculine type spirit. So it's percussive, strong, defined, clear, connected, and it's a fierce teacher of boundaries. We also have chaos, which involves release and total presence, a sense of freedom, intuition, and creativity. We have lyrical movement, which connects with the process of rebirthing. So it's expansive, it's timeless, expressive, and light yet grounded. And stillness. This is a slower motion. We're looking at convergence. So this is marked by a fusing, humbleness, mindfulness, and integration of wisdom. So bear with me for a moment as we delve into some more expansive topics on quantum mechanics. One of the first and more common laws of quantum physics is that the act of observing influences the observed. So this is a pretty significant statement, especially when we are assessing the way that we view reality. The universe is appearing as this dynamic web of inseparable energies. We have all particles dividing into probability waves of interconnection. They transcend time and space, so consciousness is both inside and outside linear time and three-dimensional space. It is omnipresent, it is everything. And because particles are connected in a way that transcends time and space, anything that happens to one particle affects all others. And these effects are superluminal, or in other words, faster than the speed of light. So quantum energy only exists as a wave of probable locations and motions in space. So as living beings, we always have free will, and so even the future cannot be read in an exact sense. We can only make educated guesses based on the direction we are choosing as a collective. But parts are seen to be an immediate connection, in which their relationships depend in an irreducible way on the state of the whole system. So this occurs on large and small scales. And this is a very important concept for humanity to understand. So we create our own reality based on our inner experience, which co-creates a broader reality that encompasses all subjective human experience as it relates to Earth's conscious cycle in particular. So we draw into ourselves that which we perceive to be real. Light and matter do not exist until there is a collapse of a wave function, and this is simulated via consciousness. So further investigation has revealed that it is consciousness which performs this action to manifest reality. Each wave function contains all of the possible outcomes of a particular situation, which would be infinite in number, but only one appears in the real world when it is collapsed by an attending state of consciousness. So they say if you are not aware of something, that it does not exist in your subjective reality. However, I think we continually reside in connected conscious space and are therefore able to pick up on subliminal currents within ourselves and others, even without the awareness factor. But then, how do we define awareness? Because I think we are aware subconsciously, but there are motivating stimuli of sorts that are capable of bringing that awareness to greater light. So much of conscious space interjects into our reality, and it can be difficult and nigh impossible, in this state at least, to separate the two until we are released from this dimensional domain. But by observing in our minds what we want to manifest through visualization, inner hearing, or direct feeling of our intentions, we can learn to create what we want. And likewise, we can deny the collapse of possibilities into things, events, and situations that we don't want by refusing to give them our attention. So there is a realm of control, but we are also navigating reality in the midst of others of whom we cannot control. So quantum mechanics is based on the science of automata, which are said to be the smallest, most indivisible building blocks of reality. This is one term for it. They are known in science as the real and imaginary or spectral components of complex waveforms. So all projection or expression originates from combinations of these two components. And since both consciousness and spirit also reside on the other side of the veil in the spectral domain, it makes sense that we can manipulate our reality better when we are in an inspired and connected state. which usually stems from a place of positivity, but it doesn't have to. When we are linked into Source, we hold more power to create true and constructive change in our own lives and our sphere of influence. And when we stay in that state of grace and appreciation, patterns begin to emerge, synchronicities increase. People want to be around us and they want to join in on that state of willed affirmation. It is much easier to collapse a positive wave function while in this mode. And I don't want to venture too far off because this topic leads into much broader subject matter. But those living beings who would be considered to have a more negative orientation can still spiritually progress and align with universal law in the same way, but it is much less common, and those beings usually take on a more authoritative or self-involved role. So, the spectral domain is an aspect of reality that contains all possible combinations of unassembled real and imaginary components. So here we are dealing with probability and potentiality. With the time domain, this aspect of reality is combined and assembled by intention into the vibrations that make up the matter, events, and circumstances of our world. So we can design and acquire resources and then assemble spectral templates, which creates patterns or frameworks upon which a real thing, event, person, situation, or other reality can eventuate into the manifested world. So we can acquire resources both mentally and physically, and these are platforms off of which we become engaged. They are ideas and thought forms that begin to take shape. We are faced with images and impressions of reality that sometimes pull at us and draw us in, and sometimes they repel. But own yourself and occupy your power. Take hold of your experiences, which ironically usually requires that you let them go, or at least your attachment to them. But take thought and emotion captive because you do have a choice. And with adaptive stochastic automata, stochastic here meaning randomly determined, so it may be analyzed statistically, but not predicted precisely, right? It's possible to build optimized models of intention, experience them with the senses, incubate them internally, and then nurture and empower them until they change one's inner manner of being and doing, which then releases out and brings about similar changes in the people, places, and things of one's outer environment. Because remember, we are highly connected and all contributions influence the collective mind. So, while the outer space of direct space is referred to as the universe, the inner world of reciprocal space is a place called the in-universe, and the dynamic variance between the two creates a tension, which functions or serves as a black hole of sorts, drawing in anything that is resonant with resolving the difference and strain. Therefore, we are all black holes wandering through space, drawing in what we need to resolve these issues in order to become a more evolved version of ourselves. Origin really does lie at the center of all these things. We are not objects walking around in space, but rather space wandering around in space. So origin and destiny are the alpha and omega of one's life. And in most aspects, the same thing. So this is all very dreamlike. So it is said that the universe is shaped like that of a torus, constantly blossoming and evolving while concurrently unraveling and giving way. So this movement is limitless, and its advancement permits an integration of chaotic change that is also managed by an equal amount of determinism or cognizant pull. So, reality manifests as arrangements of physical, mental, and spiritual energies. And the human personality is one's unique distribution of archetypes and the manner in which they go about expressing themselves. So, a person's manner of being and doing. The mind circuits in this image represent 7 stages and what is encountered during the transition from one state of being into another. So the successful traversal of these levels demands the harmonious functioning of the self, not merely one phase of such. So the growth of each part does not equal the true maturation of the whole. And I like this quote a lot because the parts really grow in proportion to the expansion of the whole self, material, intellectual, and spiritual. So we continually unfold everything we do until we are complete and whole. And this requires transformation, purification, and a refinement of the self. So people grow in relation to both past and future versions of themselves. The sum total of human realization is contained within the successive conquest of these 7 circuits of mind integration. And completion of each circuit denotes the relative maturity of a human being. And it implies that a balance has been achieved, which will look different in every living being. There's no perfect or absolute model of this. It is relative to the individual. And mastering these 7 circuits of cosmic growth does not equal spiritual fusion, but it is somewhat of a spiritual marker or indication. And of course, this is just one diagram of interpretation out of, I'm sure, many that exist, but you get the idea. The level of maturity present at any given moment determines the unit of time perspective, and that defines the width or duration of an individual's now moment. So those with narrow bandwidths have to practice patience. True maturity is born of authentic understanding and remains secure while being uncertain. And that is a mentality that is much easier said than done. But every decision you make either impedes or facilitates this evolution. So this list falls in line with the Torus model. Firstly, we are looking at the acknowledgement of ourselves, and then a release or surrender of the self, disassembly of self, purification, rearrangement, reassembly, and ultimately transformation or manifestation. So this process will be repeated many times over. I think of a loop pattern. So it may seem like we are going backwards in certain moments, but there is forward movement. And to help us achieve a smooth progression towards evolution of the self, I think it's beneficial to define who we are as people. So what are our values, goals, ideologies, self-standards, moral conduct, attractions, identifying and enhancing what's right about ourselves rather than just trying to fix what's wrong. So that doesn't mean ignoring what we wish to change, but rather putting more emphasis on our strengths and using them as leverage and helping balance out weaker areas of character. Observing how expression creates or destroys our reality and learning how to find a personal balance. Becoming aware of how to project your intentions in fully formed manners and via multiple outlets. So this could be variance in sensory outputs or conscious outputs. Resolving the difference or tension between the actual and potential aspects of ourselves. Integrating a set of change instructions to our core self and delivering, enhancing, and continually expanding them as time passes. So basically, what is it that we truly acknowledge about where we are as living beings in our current state? And how can we merge into healthier habits in considering the entirety of the body-mind-spirit complex? Mastering how to become profoundly relaxed and intensely inspired at the same time. Acquiring the skill of meditating in our waking and stimulated reality. Discovering how to be the artist of our own destiny. Practicing more effective communication. Achieving uninhibited discipline. So in other words, informed open-mindedness or diffused focus. Calibrating our unit of time perspective. So space and time are only a continuum, and the observed rate at which time passes for an object depends on the object's velocity relative to the observer. And additionally, the strength of the gravitational field affects the passage of time for an object as seen by an observer outside of the field. And gravity also, interestingly enough, bends light. So consciousness exists outside of space and time because it actually conceives and constructs space and time. Therefore, it has no edges in space and no ending in time. And I think our fears come from this limited perspective in which we identify ourselves more heavily with our bodies, or our mind, or our thoughts, or our relationships. And those are all part of the scenery. You are not the scenery, you are the seer, in which the scenery comes and goes. I think it's also important to establish an origin of certainty, so validating ourselves and being fulfilled within ourselves. So here we're taking another look at the manifestation cycle. The first step is thought. So to manifest one's intention, those real and imaginary automata must be collected, organized, and ordered into a focused concentration of intentional energy. So if you haven't picked up on it, we are wired in a very similar way to a computer, and our life is a bit like a video game. We are capable of programming ourselves, essentially. Although most of the time I think we let our environment do the programming for us, and we may or may not intervene in that process. The second step is expression, and this is the ordering of the automata via expression of the original thought. The third step is action, and proper action that takes on a quality expression results in manifestation. So once a choice has been made, those higher ordered automata take their action through the function of microtubules in the brain and begin to spread out both internally and externally. And manifestation, of course, is the fourth step. Once proper action is applied, nurturing is all that remains. So once you understand how things manifest and what part your own consciousness plays in the process, you can really begin to create change in both your inner and outer environments. Alright, so all systems, all living beings are regulated by organized fields, and whenever one species learns a new behavior, the causative field for that species is changed, however slightly. So here we are looking at morphic resonance, we're dealing with the morphogenetic field, and of course everything is connected superluminally, but this allows for behaviors and understanding to be acquired without direct prompting or physical stimuli. And in this way, we can speak of a form of memory of everything that happens in nature. But this is a type of telepathic interconnection specifically between organisms. So it's a collective memory particular to a species. There was a study written about by a guy named Rupert Sheldrake, and a group of scientists were feeding sweet potatoes to monkeys on an island, and one of these monkeys began washing the potatoes in the sea before eating them. And after a large number of monkeys, maybe roughly 100, had observed and imitated this behavior, they found that monkeys in colonies on other nearby islands were also washing their food in the ocean before eating it. I've also heard about a study in which they timed people completing crossword puzzles when they were initially released, and then after hundreds of people had already completed them. And people finished the Sunday London Times crossword puzzle significantly quicker on Monday than the Sunday puzzle takers. This can also be seen with IQ tests. These have to be continually revised because over time people begin scoring much higher than the norm. Now, are people possibly getting smarter over time? Sure. But I think this effect is still relevant. Throughout much of human history, we have lived largely from the egoic self, motivated by the survival of the body, and considered ourselves victims of disease, poverty, war, relationships, etc. And we have lived ignorant of our true identity as infinite creative consciousness. And instead, this information of limitation has entered the morphic fields and shaped our human experience. So, morphic awakening is devoted to eliminating this information of limitation and connecting us to the attractor fields of infinite potential, not only changing our personal lives, but also transforming the fields of information so as to liberate all of humanity from these past limitations. So take heart knowing that your being's sense of greater understanding is highly crucial to the development and growth of the collective. There are non-local brains around each part of the body that control that part of the body on a cellular level. And the information about how the body part is to function and move, the way it communicates with other body parts, this is all carried in the morphogenetic field. So for instance, an experimentalist might split one particle into two particles that are released in remote locations, but so long as they are entangled, they remain coordinated no matter how far apart they may be, and consciousness too acts in this way. With synergy, we're dealing with the simultaneous action of separate agencies that together have a greater total effect than the sum of their individual effects. So in layman's terms, we're not looking at a 1 + 1 = 2 equation. It's more like 1 + 1 equals, hypothetically, 6, give or take. And this is crucial for human beings as we bind together and unify for common causes. Group mind has a lot of power behind it. There is no limit to the amount of energy created universally, and this is also quite significant. Okay, so we have finally reached the last slide in this presentation anyways, over death. And death occurs when we forget who we are. So in the incarnation process of reintegrating with our greater being, we actually find more life. So I think we gain life as we grow older and truly regain ultimate life when we die. We experience an unbelievable number of deaths and endings in a lifetime. The passing of moments, the passing of relationships, and dying to old parts of ourselves so as to be renewed. So the passing of our physical body is actually the entrance door back to our pure existential state of being. One of the greatest disservices to ourselves is negating or walling off what an experience has meant to us. So the only thing that separates us from anything is ourselves. But ideally, through this walk of life, we are reaching back into our soul unit and utilizing that grounding force as a guide in further advancing learning in this realm. And by releasing our walls of illusion, we gain power, knowledge, truth, and in most cases, we are able to connect with love in a very profound way. I like this quote from a book called The Raw Material, Law of One. And if you haven't read it, I do highly recommend it. He says, "Let us give the example of a man who sees all the poker hands. He then knows the game. It is but child's play to gamble, for it is no risk. The other hands are known, the possibilities are known, and the hand will be played correctly, but with no interest. In time-space and in the true color green density, the hands of all are open to the eye. The thoughts, the feelings, the troubles, all these may be seen. There is no deception and no desire for deception. Thus much may be accomplished in harmony, but the mind-body-spirit gains little polarity from this interaction." But let us re-examine this metaphor and multiply it into the longest poker game you can imagine, a lifetime. The cards are love, dislike, limitation, unhappiness, pleasure, etc. They are dealt and redealt continuously. You may, during this incarnation, begin, and we stress to begin, to know your own cards. You may begin to find the love within you. You may begin to balance your pleasure, your limitations, etc. However, your only indication of other selves' cards is to look into the eyes. You cannot remember your hand, their hands, perhaps even the rules of the game. This game can only be won by those who lose their cards in the melting influence of love, can only be won by those who lay their pleasures, their limitations, their all upon the table, face up, and say inwardly, "All of you players, each other self, whatever your hand, I love you." This is the game to know, to accept, to forgive, to balance, and to open the self in love. This cannot be done without the forgetting, for it would carry no weight in the life of the mind-body-spirit beingness totality.